World War I continues to fascinate me, particularly what caused it. And the reason for it is that, not that World War I was the biggest, bloodiest war of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, World War II certainly earned that distinction. But the fact is that World War I was the cause of everything else that occurred in the 20th century, including World War II, the Cold War, and as a matter of fact, it continues to have an impact even today. Now, Max Hasings, who I think is a great historian, and his books on World War II, different aspects of it and so on, they're absolutely sensational. Well, he wrote this book, which is a history of the war as it started and as it unfolded during 1914, just the 1 year. Now, in terms of how the war started and who's to blame and so on, there are a lot of really plausible arguments that you could make for assigning blame to different countries in this. Max Hasings makes no bones about it. He assigns all the blame to Germany for giving Austria a blank check in terms of dealing with Serbia. Now, what you're going to compare the first half of Catastrophe 2 is going to be Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark. Now, Sleepwalkers was exclusively concerned with the start of the war, who was responsible, and Christopher Clark ends up concluding that you can't really assign blame, and he kind of paints a picture where there are all these different power centers, centers of influence and decision-making in all the different powers that were involved in the war, on the European side. Now, Max Hasings takes a somewhat different approach. He covers the same ground. In other words, he goes into some detail, not quite as laboriously as Christopher Clark, in terms of what was going on in the Balkans. But at the end of the day, he ends up assigning the guilt for the war really exclusively to Germany, and specifically for Germany's having given Austria a blank check in terms of whatever it was that they wanted to do with Serbia. Now, the second half of the book, I think, is quite good. It covers in great detail and in a very interesting, well-paced way the development of the war, particularly on the Western Front. Now, he does get into the Eastern Front a little bit with what Hindenburg and Ludendorff were doing, what the Russians were doing, the Serbians. But I think his best treatment is of the war in Western Europe. And he is merciless in terms of criticizing the military leaders on all sides, with the exception, I think, of the French. He really singles out Generals Joffre and Gallieni for praise in terms of their ability to pull off the miracle of the Marne. He's absolutely brutal in his treatment of Sir John French and the way the British managed their participation, such as it was in the early part of the war. Now, he's I'd say fairly complimentary in terms of Lord Kitchener, and unfortunately Lord Kitchener didn't last very long. So you've got a book that is a kind of a combination of the diplomatic history of 1914 leading up to the start of the war in August, and then the actual conduct of hostilities once things got going in the second half of 1914. Now, it's still, much like Christopher Clark, it's still kind of an intimidating book. It's pretty big, covers a lot of topics, but Max Hasings writes in a very, very clever, as I say, well-paced, well-written kind of way. Now, if you want to cover much the same ground, but in I'd say, a much more manageable, less challenging way, you still can't go wrong with The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. I know there's been a lot more research concluded and a lot more things found out about everything that was going on that she, quite frankly, didn't have access to, and she wasn't a professional historian. But The Guns of August is still, I think, the classic in terms of this. But if you want to take it a step further, Catastrophe 1914 by Max Hasings is the way to go. Thoroughly recommend this book. See you next week.